Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching World War I Part 3, 1916 by Epic History. Now last time we saw as the war got into full swing, a lot of new technologies were introduced and a lot of war crimes were committed. Today we'll be continuing World War I. The Entente had a pretty hard time in the last episode, so we'll see how things play out this time. Now before we jump in, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
World War I was supposed to have been a short and glorious war.
Yeah, apparently.
But by 1916, a new kind of industrialized warfare had seen the death toll soar into the millions, with no end in sight. Naval blockades were beginning to cause shortages of food and fuel across Europe.
Well, we discussed the concept of total war last time, right? We saw that this was affecting not just the soldiers, not just the military-aged male population, but the entire citizenry of each country, right? Their economies were becoming dedicated to keeping this massive worldwide war going. Blockades were being done. Germany tried to blockade Britain, Britain trying to blockade Germany, shortages of food, other supplies, right? This was difficult for everybody. Of course, you'd seen civilian populations and economies dedicated to warfare before. It's not like this was a first, but sort of the scale and the level of that dedication and how affected people were was unprecedented, as with many things about World War I.
While thousands of women had entered the workforce, replacing the men sent to fight in their millions. All sides were preparing for a long war.
War of attrition. Yeah, this war began, everyone was hoping for the big, glorious battle. They could blow each other up with their new technology, end the war quickly, but by this point, and frankly, before this point, it had become a war of attrition, right? Everyone was entrenched, literally in this case, facing each other, gaining very little pieces of territory, turned into a war of attrition, right? Can you wear your enemy down over time? Now, that could mean wearing them down in terms of supplies, but it often meant literally manpower, right? If your enemy kept losing more and more men, well, maybe eventually they would surrender, right? This was, a lot of wars are wars over land. So little land throughout this war was lost and gained, apart from a couple of points, right? Most of it, both sides are entrenched, fighting over a little chunk of land. It was really human lives that were being fought over, right? Many millions of people were being sent into the meat grinder, essentially, sent forward to die, not really gaining much territory, right? That's how we get to this war of attrition.
The war has raged for a year and a half as the Allies continue to battle the Central Powers, recently joined by Bulgaria. At sea, the British maintain their naval blockade of Germany, preventing the import of food and other vital raw materials. Germany has retaliated with a U-boat blockade of Britain, but has to limit its attacks to avoid provoking the neutral USA, whose citizens have already been caught in the crossfire.
Yep, we saw that German U-boats were targeting civilian ships, trading vessels. Now, to be fair, those trading vessels were often carrying arms for the British, but in targeting those trading vessels, they often killed a lot of civilians, including American civilians. And so, not wanting to provoke the ire of the United States, Germany, for now, has pulled back on the U-boat warfare. Now, as we know, that does not last forever. America does eventually get involved in the conflict, but at the moment, that is something Germany is trying to avoid.
On the Western Front, French, British and Belgian troops are dug in opposite the Germans, both sides trapped in the bloody stalemate of trench warfare.
Yeah.
On the Eastern Front, the Russians have ended their long retreat and stabilized the line, but their army has suffered huge losses. On the Italian front, Italian troops have launched a series of costly, unsuccessful attacks against strong Austro-Hungarian defences. While on the Balkan front, the Central Powers have overrun Serbia, whose army is forced to make a bitter retreat through the Albanian mountains.
Yeah, we saw that Serbia had so valiantly resisted Austria from the beginning of the war, and this, of course, was sort of the initial epicenter, right? This is where and why the war kicked off. Now, very quickly, the center of the conflict moved away. Serbia had resisted until more countries, particularly Bulgaria in this place, got involved, and the Serbian army had been pushed out. Serbia losing an immense amount of soldiers and civilians, especially if you consider the small population of the country.
Now, on the 5th of January, Austro-Hungarian troops attack Montenegro. They are delayed at the Battle of Mojkovac, but 3 weeks later, Montenegro is forced to surrender. On the Caucasus front, the Russians launch a surprise winter offensive against Ottoman Turkish forces. 6 weeks later, Russian troops occupy the city of Erzurum. In April, they capture the Black Sea port of Trebizond. Meanwhile, the British transport 2 motorboats to Lake Tanganyika in Africa. They finally arrive after a 10,000-mile trip by sea and land.
Damn.
And help the British seize control of the strategic lake from local German forces.
How about that?
The same month, in German Cameroon, German troops besieged on Mora Mountain for 18 months finally surrender to the Allies. It marks the end of the Cameroon campaign.
Verdun, the mill on the Meuse.
On the Western Front, the Germans unleash a devastating assault on the French fortress town of Verdun. German General Erich von Falkenhayn knows France will defend this symbolic town to the last man. His plan, in his own words, is to bleed France white in its defense. It is the strategy of attrition.
Yep, and of course Verdun is one of the most famous battles of this conflict, and if we're talking about World War I as a war of attrition, this is one of the battles that's most emblematic of that, right? This is one of the best examples. You can really see that attrition at play here.
Verdun becomes one of the most terrifying battles of the war. A mincing machine, where infantry divisions are destroyed almost as fast as they can be fed into the line.
I think I used that same comparison earlier.
In Britain, 1 million men have already volunteered for military service. But the government realizes it won't be enough. Britain becomes the last major power to introduce conscription. That spring, on the Western Front, British troops are the last to be issued with steel helmets. The nature of trench warfare produces a high proportion of head wounds. The German Stahlhelm, the French Adrian helmet, and the British Mark I steel helmet offer limited protection from shell splinters and shrapnel.
I think those helmets are one of the more iconic sort of pieces of clothing from this conflict, pieces of armor, especially the German and the British helmets. They are pretty iconic, very closely associated with World War I, along with the gas masks that I talked about in the last episode. But you can imagine you're stuck there in a trench. You've got, oftentimes a lot of, sometimes literal artillery, but oftentimes shrapnel, rubble. You got a lot of stuff falling on your head. And so, like I said, the helmets can provide, some protection.
Neutral Portugal has been cooperating with the British, which seems to offer the best chance of holding on to her African colony, Portuguese Angola. On the 9th of March, Germany retaliates by declaring war on Portugal.
You see this a lot with a lot of wars, but the world wars especially, where some countries sort of want to remain neutral, but their neutrality is not real neutrality, right? They don't want to get involved in the war, but they've taken a side. right? Portugal, a historical ally of Britain. They continue to be allied here. You can see it in World War II, especially, even in a little bit in World War One, but especially in World War II, where America is obviously on the side of the Brits. They're selling and loaning them a bunch of weapons. They're doing a lot of deals with them, but they're technically neutral, right, up until Pearl Harbor, right? So neutrality doesn't always actually mean neutrality. It usually just means I don't want to be involved in the war itself, even if I have a preferred side.
On the Eastern Front, Russia launches an attack near Lake Narok to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun. But it's a disaster. There are 100,000 Russian casualties, and the attack fails to divert any German troops from the fighting at Verdun. In Dublin, Irish Republicans launch an armed revolt against British rule. It becomes known as the Easter Rising, and is put down after 6 days of street fighting.
Yeah, I mean, you know, with war comes strife, revolution, riots. Of course, not in this episode, but I believe in the next one, we're going to see the revolution in Russia. I don't know how much they get into that, but you know, with such a massive conflict, so much destruction, so much chaos, you're going to get some political strife. The Arab Revolt. Okay.
In the Middle East, after a 5-month siege, British forces at Kut surrender. General Townsend leads 9,000 British and Indian soldiers into captivity. About half later die from starvation or disease.
So things aren't going super hot for the Brits in the Middle East yet.
Britain wants Arab support in its fight against the Ottoman Empire, so it's promised Arab leaders an independent Arab state after the war. But
yeah, there's a couple of deals being made, some of which literally conflict with each other. So Britain's doing a bit of double dealing. But the idea here is, right, that Britain wants to take the fight to the Ottoman Empire. They want to help out especially their ally Russia. And they know, you know, the Ottoman Empire's been crumbling for more than 100 years at this point. It's been losing territory. A lot of the territory they've lost has been in the Balkans. That's been the most visible. But they know there are a lot of peoples throughout the remaining Ottoman Empire who'd rather not be in the Ottoman Empire, right? So they want to take advantage of some of that nationalism or sort of revolutionary ideology and use it to fight against the Ottomans.
now, Britain and France secretly signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, planning after the war to divide the Middle East into British and French zones of control. Unaware of this deal, Hussein bin Ali, Sharif of Mecca, leads the Arabs in revolt against Turkish Ottoman rule.
Britain's got a lot of things going on, right? They promise an independent Arab state. They've got this deal behind the scenes where they actually, essentially, want to carve up the Middle East into colonies or protectorates, or whatever new fancy word they've come up for to describe a colony. Of course, this is in this war. You also got the Balfour Declaration, which is what, leads to the creation of Israel, right? So you've got a lot of things going on. Like I said, the Brits are making a lot of deals that conflict with each other directly.
In the Battle of Mecca, his forces seize control of the Holy City. On the Italian front, Austro-Hungarian forces
I wonder if we're going to talk about T.E. Lawrence a little bit, Lawrence of Arabia.
Launch a surprise attack at Asiago. Italian defences give way. Austro-Hungarian troops are poised to break through into northern Italy. That month, in the North Sea, the German High Seas Fleet clashes with the British Grand Fleet at the Battle of Jutland. In the only major naval battle of the war, the British suffer heavier losses, but claim victory as the German fleet withdraws and does not re-emerge from its base for the rest of the war.
Yeah, no one really wants to lose their dreadnoughts, especially the Germans, who've really been building this fleet up rapidly. I mean, the Brits had started building to match them, but no one wants to lose their precious ships. The big push.
For the summer of 1916, the Allies have planned major simultaneous offensives against the Central Powers, from east and west. Now they are needed more than ever to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun and the Italians at Asiago. The Russians launched their attack first. On the Eastern Front, General Alexei Brusilov has carefully maintained the element of surprise. His troops break through the enemy lines, in some places advancing 60 miles and taking 200,000 prisoners. This brilliant, though costly, Russian attack achieves its aim, as the Central Powers are forced to redeploy troops from other fronts to shore up the line.
Russia finds themselves some success on the Eastern Front. Like they said, it is still very costly, right? All of this takes an immense amount of manpower, and you lose a lot of manpower doing it, but they have accomplished their nominal goal.
At sea, British cruiser HMS Hampshire, en route to Russia, hits a mine and sinks off Orkney. Among the 650 dead is Britain's iconic Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener.
Oh, interesting.
3 days later, in the Adriatic, Italian troop ship Principe Umberto is sunk by a German submarine. It's the deadliest sinking of the war, with 1,900 lives lost.
Jesus.
On the Western Front, Britain and France launched their major summer offensive, the Battle of the Somme. Hopes are
probably, I don't know, alongside Verdun, the two most iconic battles of this conflict. Maybe. The Somme, Verdun, they're definitely some of the most iconic battles. At least from a sort of British-American perspective. These are the ones I definitely hear about the most and that are most well-known from World War I.
High for a breakthrough, but the first day is a disaster. A long Allied artillery bombardment fails to knock out German defences, and waves of British infantry are cut down by machine gun fire as they advance into no man's land. In the space of a few hours, the British suffer 57,000 casualties, a third of them killed.
Damn.
It's the worst day in the history of the British Army.
Yeah, I mean, that is truly, truly an immense amount of men to lose in that period of time. I say this every episode, but it's just hard for me to truly conceptualize or to try and have you guys conceptualize the amount of people that are dying in this, right? It's truly an incalculable, I mean, it's not literally incalculable, but to think of it, right? To think of it, it's so many people being lost in such a short span of time. It's truly unbelievable. And of course, incredibly tragic. The whole war is.
But more attacks are ordered, and the battle will rage for another 5 months.
Romania joins the war. Hey, new player.
Encouraged by the Russian advance, Romania joins the Allies. But despite an initially successful advance into Transylvania, Romania quickly faces a counter-offensive from German, Bulgarian, and Austro-Hungarian forces. The Allied force at Salonika tries to support Romania by launching their own offensive towards Monastir. With Serbian troops in the lead, there are small gains, but dogged Bulgarian resistance prevents a breakthrough.
You can always hide out in the mountains.
On the Western Front, General von Falkenhayn finally calls off the attack at Verdun. The French army has honored their commander, General Naval's promise. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. But victory comes at a terrible,
pretty iconic phrase,
price. 365,000 casualties. The Germans lose almost as many.
And this is where you really get to the sort of tragedy of the whole thing, along with the sort of critiques of the leadership in this one. I have talked about this in previous episodes, but, you know, this is a conflict, of course, fought by the regular people of the world, right? Just your average folks. But they're not the ones who are planning it, or the ones who started it. Well, and I mean, Gavrilo Princip was sort of in some ways a regular dude, but you get my point, right? It is the sort of heads of Europe, the generals of the continent, who are orchestrating this conflict, and the way they decide to do it, is sort of in some ways using older strategies with newer technologies, is just to throw millions of men into the meat grinder, right? It's not an incredibly ethical way of fighting. In fact, it's pretty horrible. Lots of people recognize that throughout the conflict, and that, of course, angers many people. Coming out of World War One, Europe is not a very happy place, right? People are horrified, they're upset, they're angry, right? A lot of people feel sort of betrayed in one way or another, particularly in Germany, but in other places as well, right? There's definitely a critique of this that, I mean, it's not really groundbreaking stuff, but that you've got all these ordinary people out there who are just being sent time after time to their deaths by the commanders or their generals at the top. Yeah, it's a pretty despicable strategy, right?
Verdun remains one of the bloodiest battles in human history. For his defeat at Verdun, Falkenhayn is sacked, and Germany's heroes of the Eastern Front, von Hindenburg and Ludendorff, take command in the west. Meanwhile,
and these two are going to stick around. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, I mentioned this before. I think I mention it every episode. But of course, their sort of rise to prominence continues. And both during and after the war, Hindenburg especially, but also Ludendorff, they're going to be important political figures in Germany.
Battle of the Somme continues. Near the village of Flers, the British introduce a new weapon they hope can break the deadlock of the trenches. It is called the tank.
Oh, interesting.
But despite some small successes, the first tanks are too few in number and too prone to mechanical failure to make any real impact.
Prone to mechanical failure, getting bogged down in the mud. So, not a massive impact yet, but of course, we know the tank is going to be extremely important in warfare to come.
On the Eastern Front, Russia's Brusilov offensive comes to an end. Casualty estimates vary wildly, but it's clear both sides have suffered catastrophic losses.
Yeah, holy
Neither the Russian nor the Austro-Hungarian army ever fully recovers.
God damn. Talk about casualty numbers. You want to see the big casualties, look towards the Eastern Front, right? Yeah, they don't recover, and the empires of those armies don't recover either. I've been saying this, but look at the amount of casualties being taken, and then remind yourself that Austria-Hungary and the Russian Empire, in that form, they're not going to survive this war. Both of them are going to collapse. Or be broken up, however you want to describe it.
On the Italian front, heavy fighting rages throughout the autumn, as Italian forces make repeated, costly assaults against Austro-Hungarian positions along the Isonzo River. The Battle of the Somme comes to an end amid autumn rain and mud. The Allies have advanced 10 miles at the cost of 600,000 casualties.
Jesus.
German losses are about 450,000. The Allies reassure themselves that this is a winning strategy.
Right, and this is, I'm talking about sort of the critiques of the strategy during this conflict, all the men that were lost. You've got some of these generals at the top, military theorists. Some people were like, this is not working, this is not how it should work. But some, and some in positions of power were saying either, this is how it has to be, or this is the right way to do it, right? We're gaining territory. We just need to toss tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of more men into this war to die into no man's land, right? There is, in some ways, a pretty callous disregard for the amount of people's lives that were being lost, which I think is one of the reasons why this war, along with its connection to World War II, of course, it's the direct lead up, in some ways causes it, is why this war is so closely sort of memorialized, remembered. The victims of the conflict are memorialized, right? We definitely try to do that today because the attitude during the war was a little different. Not from everybody, once again, not from everybody, but from some.
Because at this rate, Germany will run out of men first.
Ugh.
Meanwhile, disaster engulfs Romania, as the country is overrun by the Central Powers. Romanian forces suffer 250,000 casualties. The remnants of its army take position alongside the Russians on the Eastern Front. That winter, Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria since 1848, dies.
Talk about serving over an incredibly long period of time. From 1848, this man has seen the transformation of his country, the Austrian Empire, Austria-Hungary. He won't live to see the end of it, but it will end, right? But, I mean, he essentially lives from 1848, which is an incredibly transformative moment in his country's history, until almost the end of it. Right? He sees a lot of history throughout his life.
He is succeeded by Karl. In Britain, Prime Minister Herbert Asquith is forced from office and succeeded by David Lloyd George, while General Joffre is replaced as French Commander-in-Chief by General Naval, who promises victory through bold, aggressive action. Amid the comings and goings, US President Woodrow Wilson's attempts to mediate a peace settlement come to nothing.
Yeah, though Americans have been pissed off by the Lusitania, I'm sure we'll talk about the Zimmerman telegram at some point. Americans generally are not, super happy with what's going on, but they still want to remain out of the conflict, and that's what Woodrow Wilson has promised, right? He said, I'm not going to get us into this conflict, right? And of course, Woodrow Wilson, being himself, wants to sort of step in and graciously mediate a peace. Now, it's not really going to work like that, but that's sort of where America is at that moment. But as we know, it's not too long until America does get involved.
Neither side is willing to make concessions.
All right. We're going to end it right there with 1917. How about that? So, 1916, like I said, we always got some pretty devastating stuff in these videos. We'll be heading into 1917 next. We've got some big developments to come. We saw some of the more famous battles of the conflict in this one. The Somme, Verdun, right? Some pretty important events. We're going to get a lot more important events in the next video. So if you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. I hope all you guys are having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.